Peter, thank you very much for joining me. It's a huge pleasure to have you on again.
Great to be here.
And Peter, this is actually, I think the second book you've written in this series of ancient lives, Horace, Poet on a Volcano. And I have to say, I absolutely love this series of books. It's just fantastic from Yale.
Yeah, no, they're doing a really good job, and we're doing things in a slightly different way. And this book, in many ways, I think really does sum up the issues about this series, and and confront that question as what you can gain historically from poetry and what you can't. What you can say about someone's life from their work and what you can't. They're quite big questions which are not always directly dealt with, and this Yale series allows me to look into those, look quite carefully at those.
Yes. So Horace, I mean, have you sort of been interested in Horace and loved Horace's poetry since an undergraduate stage, or is this a love that's developed a little bit more recently?
It's a peculiar story, Horace. Everybody at every time has, so many millions of people, over the last 2,000 years have found some love or some relationship for Horace in some way. He's one of the most used and abused poets that we've ever been. I think my first encounter with him was probably, without even knowing it, was as a schoolboy. My badge on my blazer, I went to one of those schools which wasn't really quite as good as it hoped it would be, but thought if you had a very fancy badge, it would kind of look a bit better. And it said on the bottom of it, "Incipe," which in Latin means begin. And I remember saying to even the Latin master, "So what is this incipe? What are we supposed to begin?" And of course, he hadn't got the faintest idea. And, begin what? And it turned out, years later, when I sort of realised when I was at Oxford that actually this incipe means to get on with it. This advice that Horace gave to a young man who wasn't really doing his homework very much, but because it was picked up by Immanuel Kant, and it meant, and you were supposed to begin to dare to know, get on with it, do your work. Don't wait for the perfect conditions before you open your book or cross the river or do anything. Get on with it. And it's a good, many of schoolmasters and philosophers and others have found some reason for sort of promoting this as a slogan. And Horace is the afterlife of Horace is full of him being, pillaged for slogans. And Carpe Diem being one of the most famous, Nunc est bibendum. Incipe was my first one on my school badge, even though I hadn't got the faintest idea what it meant.
So does that mean then he's been kind of he's sort of these small phrases have been wrenched from Horace's prose and turned and completely sort of in a way butchered, and we've taken a meaning from him that really is not fair on him?
I think he knew this would happen. It was all poetry. There's no prose, but he did. But yes, he had a sort of yearning and a certainty that his work would be saved for posterity, which is rather touching. I mean, he boasted about that, and it turned out to be true. But it was saved for posterity in often some very strange ways. And because they were short poems, for the most part, they were particularly well suited to the classroom. And if you could strip out the ones that I write about at the beginning of the book, which no one ever writes about, which are some extremely obscene and unpleasant, manic poems that he wrote when he first came back from the part of the Civil War, and if you take those out, and try and dilute some of the gay sex or any sex at all, you can more or less do, and concentrate on the sort of good patriotic stuff, if that's what you want to be teaching, you can produce very, very good sort of Latin lessons out of Horace. And Horace really was always terrified of that, but it didn't always do him very much good, but it did keep his name alive when a lot of other poets and writers disappeared.
Because you've mentioned the Civil War, because he sort of comes of age right at the assassination of Julius Caesar.
Yeah, he did. He was sort of effectively at university then. He was in Athens, which was the kind of university city for aspiring Romans. And although Horace came from a very poor background, his father had formerly been a slave, and had sort of come good in business, but he wasn't from the top of society by any means, not even really from the middle of it. But his father had managed to save up money and invested in his son's education and sent him off to Athens. So there he was with a lot of the toffs, a bit like sort of, the boy from Wigan at Oxford in the 1920s, those kind of stories. And there he was. And then the news comes that Julius Caesar's been assassinated. And suddenly Athens becomes full of a lot of the people who'd either assassinated Caesar, like Brutus, or were sympathetic with the people who'd assassinated Caesar, like Cicero's son and others. And they all ship up in Athens. And a lot of idealistic young men, all of whom think that Brutus stands for freedom and liberty and keeping the old ways, and that Julius Caesar was a tyrant. And so, Horace is at an impressionable age, you might say. And so when Brutus turns up, he follows Brutus and all his other new posh mates, and they march up with an enormous army that they gather to Philippi to fight Octavian and Mark Antony, the heirs to Caesar. And that was a bloody and a very unpleasant experience for Horace, I'm sure it was. And of course he lost. And so at that stage, his life was at a pretty low ebb.
He wouldn't have been expected to sort of kill himself at the end of this battle. He wasn't that important in that, in that regard.
No, not at all. Absolutely not. And he was a sort of, he was promoted towards the end because sort of all the posh boys were, everybody had a place. That was the way the army worked. So no question of him killing himself, and no suggestion that he would do that or even think about doing that. In fact, everything you think about Horace was the last thing he would do under any circumstances. That kind of old Roman stoic attitudes that we associate with Brutus, who did kill himself, were not we're absolutely as far from Horace as you can imagine. No, he just somehow had to get back, and getting away from a battlefield on which you've been on the losing side, can be much misinterpreted. I suspect he very carefully sort of melded his way, and sort of he talks about sort of basically being picked up in a sort of jokey way by a god in a cloud and taken back as though he was on a sort of field at Troy. But that's just sort of poetic way of saying somehow God knows how I actually got out of there.
It's such a tumultuous time for Rome, but Horace, I guess he, as you say, humble beginnings. His father was a slave.
Well, an ex-slave, to be fair. He's been a slave. That was quite common in Rome. You could come in and out of slavery. You weren't. It wasn't. It's often misunderstood that if you were in Greece, by and large, once a slave, always a slave, and in most places, once a slave, always a slave. Romans have actually got a very bad reputation for being, unpleasant and vicious and less civilized than the nice Greeks. Where actually, if you were going to be a slave anywhere, Rome was a slightly better place because there was a bit more fluidity between the slave status and the free status. Perhaps not much, but it was better than nothing. And so you could easily fall into slavery, like in a civil war, which is what Horace's father probably did. And you could get yourself out of it if you were to get together some money, or you were lucky. And that's what his father did too. But it was still a stigma attached to him. And he was one he was quite sensitive to throughout his life.
So when does Horace start really making a name for himself? Is it once he's returned from sort of fighting in the Civil War.
Yeah, well, when he gets back from the fighting, he's in a bad state because his father's died, and his father's land, and probably most of his property, has somehow been suborned by the victors. Octavian needed to take land to pay off his troops, and so there was massive sort of land confiscations all over Italy. Now we don't know a great deal about this, but what we do know is that Horace essentially ended up with nothing or very little, and he got himself a job as a clerk. He still had some good friends because he had made some good contacts when he was fighting for Brutus, so he was not completely thus abandoned. But he had quite a rough time, and those early poems, the ones that are never taught, and because they're extremely foul, I mean, they really are misogynistic and nasty. And
when you say nasty, just sort of how nasty?
Well, there are two poems where he describes the bad experiences with older women in bed, and why he's completely unable to satisfy them in bed because they're so ugly. And then he goes through all their various failings, that they smell like goat and octopus, and that they wear disgusting makeup which smells of crocodile excrement, and which they sort of smear all over the sheets, and it goes on and on and on, and really they'd be much more satisfied by an elephant than by him. And it's brutal stuff. And although it is, there are some, as they coyly say in the books, Greek antecedents for this, which is their attempt to suggest that actually none of it actually happened to Horace. It was just sort of copying out a bit of Archilochus or some other ancient poet. It also seems to me that he didn't have to copy out Archilochus, and that he was in a pretty crazy state when he came back from the war, as anybody might be. And there's a whole definite ring of truth about these poems, but not one that anybody would want to teach in the classroom.
No. But is this a sort of a way of him sort of, I don't know, flexing his poetical muscles? He's trying things out.
Yeah, absolutely. And his central, the central idea of his life was that there was this extraordinary poetry in Greece from different periods, and it used these extraordinary meters, and it seemed to have this extraordinary freedom, and a whole lot of aspects of a poet's life that appealed to him, which wasn't visible in any poetry that had then been written in Rome, or very little, or only parts of it. I mean, he made huge strides and that was his great boast, in taking various kinds of Greek poetry and putting it into Rome, into Latin. And although that sounds like a rather sort of technical and rather sort of pointless, I mean, why would anybody now be interested in that? The combination of his genius as a poet and this extraordinary technical struggle, and then the mastery of that struggle, did created some of the most enduring, poems that the ones that people did teach at school, and which people have enjoyed and admired and fallen in love with over 2,000 years.
So which are the works really then that have, I mean, is it the first, there's a first collection, but because he's not published, how did the publishing process work for him? And then which were the ones that really brought him to the fore?
Well, in his mind, he never really came to the fore. I mean, he boasted that his poetry would last forever, but the publishing system was pretty, well, it's not really like ours. You produced your rolled up bits of parchment, and they were copied out by slaves. So you wouldn't have had that many copies of them, and then they'd be sent around to your friends, and you'd hope that they would copy them and send them off to other friends. And still, you weren't talking about a huge readership. But you particularly wanted, obviously, to impress your closest friends and your sort of people at the top of society, including the emperor, and including the people who you addressed a lot of these poems to. So a lot of the people he'd fought with at Philippi in this great battle or fought against then became the people who were receiving these poems. And it was, and so when they came out in different ways, but the big year when they came out was a very, very difficult year in the history of Imperial Rome. And really, people had a lot more on their mind than whether Horace's poems were any good. And also his poems were very difficult for people who spoke Latin and lived in Latin. Although schoolboys might find them struggle to put them together and work out what they all meant. That a lot of Romans at the time were doing exactly the same. This was not easy poetry, and there were not enormous numbers of copies. And Augustus had more in his mind than praising Horace, and so did a lot of other people. So even when he died, he wasn't he didn't feel as though his achievement had been fully recognised. Though of course he was not the first or the last poet to think that. I'm not sure I can think of any poet who died thinking their work was fully recognised. But Horace certainly didn't think so.
Yeah, maybe it's Byron about the only one.
Well, Byron, of course, famously gave up Horace at school. He writes, about how Horace had been sort of inculcated out of him in the classroom, and though later in life, actually, Byron and indeed all the romantics tended to use and quote from Horace quite a lot. But I think the way it was taught at school certainly didn't attract Byron very much.
And was Ovid a sort of close contemporary of Horace's? So again, Ovid probably had the same sort of.
Well, each one of these poets had slightly different trajectories. If we're talking about what happened later, I mean, obviously Ovid was disgraced in his own lifetime and lived the last decades of his life in a very uncomfortable exile on the Black Sea, which he wrote a lot of verse letters complaining bitterly about. But then his poems, particularly, took off because of the extraordinary sort of fantastical nature of the Metamorphoses. I mean, Ovid and Horace were both extremely popular. Virgil was very popular because he was so serious, and the Christians tried to sort of adopt. But they couldn't really adopt Horace or Ovid very easily, but they had a good go at Virgil. There were various lines of transmission by which these poets survived, but Horace's was in for the most part in very small chunks.
Was he popular sort of more from the ground upwards? I mean, Virgil almost gets the sort of imperial seal of approval, whereas is Horace more popular amongst?
No. They're all elite. They were all elite. It was only for the elite all round, really. There was no popular readership. There was very low literacy for a start. If you could perform it as drama, and some people think that there was quite an active performance of not just poetry but prose. That Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars was sort of read out at street corners, and that Horace would perhaps perform his poetry with a lyre. And there'd been lots of Renaissance paintings and pictures of that kind of thing. It's a bit murky. We don't really know whether that happened or not. I think what we can be pretty certain of is that most of these poets were not particularly well known. Occasionally, you get a line of Virgil perhaps the most. On the walls of Pompeii, when the volcano erupted a few decades later, there were quotes, sort of satirical quotes from Virgil of the most famous lines. A little bit of Lucretius, but no Horace. He was an elite taste.
And then, how has he been then received? I mean, okay, the first time I had come across him was probably in 1989's Dead Poets Society. Did that kind of, I know this just sounds like a rather slightly infantile question, but did that kind of cause any kind of revival in Horace?
I really don't know. Horace is, I think the main, depends what you mean by revival. I mean, Horace has always had.
He's always been there, right?
He's always been there, for people who love Latin and taught Latin and read Latin. He certainly was big in schools. He was also big in sort of art criticism, because he wrote again a good example of his stuff being taken out of context. He wrote a very crazy letter to the Piso family, a kind of rich family who lived in Herculaneum. That's the town next to Pompeii that also was smashed by the earthquake. And he was setting out a certain amount of advice to the young boys as to how they should, if they wanted to become writers, the kind of thing they should do. A lot of it is extremely platitudinous, and it by no means his kind of best work. But it was, and some bits of it is totally bonkers, and it shows towards the end, which is where my title of the book comes from, The Poet on a Volcano, his extreme extreme dissatisfaction and insecurity. He was a perfectionist who felt his perfection hadn't been appreciated, perhaps hadn't been perfect enough. And if the earth could open up and he could just disappear into a volcano, that would be the best thing. And people would just think he disappeared, and he was crazy. It's crazy stuff. But a later Latin writer called Quintilian thought actually we could turn this into like a textbook. So he renamed it the Ars Poetica, which is how it appears in all the textbooks, in all the texts now. And that became, because they didn't have any textbooks and they were looking for things to teach people to write, they turned that into like the standard sort of creative writing class book, the only one they had. And although it wasn't really very suitable, and it was a lot of the advice that he gave, went straight into into everybody's idea as to how you should write, including some very useful things like the phrase "in medias res." That if you're starting a novel or a short story or a play, you don't start. He was born under a mountain, on the side of a mountain. You find the most exciting bit. You start in the middle when things, and get your readers going. And if you want to go back and reprise his birth on the mountain, you do that later on. I mean, Horace had with plenty of little bits of good advice, but most importantly, they were very crisply expressed, and it was the crispness of the expression that made his work last. Plus, people's great desire to have books that they could teach from.
But that piece of advice you've just mentioned, that's very interesting, because is that one of the earliest, or the earliest, advice on not beginning at the beginning, but beginning at something that will grab the reader? Because that's having read a lot of history books. So many people do this.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it's the greatest encapsulation. I mean, obviously, it wasn't the first time an artist had done it. I mean, Homer had grasped that. Homer doesn't start. He doesn't start at the beginning. There are plenty of writers, I think, before him had grasped that you should, find a dramatic moment to start. But it's that sense late in his life. It's by no means his best work, but it became one of his most famous, simply because it was so easy to gut for good lines.
So, what do you think is his best work?
Well, I think the Odes, in the middle of his life, to say, if we divide him into three, the first period of these satirical, often quite vicious, iambic epos of the misogyny and everything, which also included some quite witty description. I mean, one of my favourite pieces of his is reasonably early. It's a poem called "The Journey to Brundisium," the satire, and he goes off on a diplomatic journey. He's a hanger-on, really, on a diplomatic journey with Augustus's man Maecenas to meet Mark Antony's people. But you would never know from the poem the high politics that's going on. You know, he's not interested, or certainly not telling us anything about the politics of it. But he describes the drunken boatman. He describes the sort of the fighting and the louts. He describes the bits of the food. He describes, what happens when the girl he was expecting to come and share his bed in the inn didn't turn up and went with somebody else, and the awful noise of the frogs cluck cluck cluck, glog glog glogging all night, and what the countryside looked like. I mean, some of these things look absolute staples of travel writing. I mean, some of it I think you could say was the first recognizable travel writing, and that's one of my absolute favourites. That early satire, and then there were the very beautiful odes, silly word odes. It all puts everybody off. I mean, they're poems. Odes makes it just sound as though they were sort of pompous, and they were beautiful poems, often on the sort of fleeting nature of life. Ehu fugaces, postime, everything about the nature goes round in a circle. Spring follows winter, summer follows spring, and it goes round and round and round. But life only goes one way. You only pass this way once, and you're going to end up in Hades forever. So live life when you can. Carpe diem. If you're talking to women, come to bed with me as soon as possible. Don't start arguing about horoscopes or what the future will hold. There was a range of very, very beautiful poems on these themes, which are the ones which have endeared him to so many readers of poetry. And then towards the end of his life, he the sort of third phase, they do overlap quite a bit, but the third phase, he was always very anxious that civil war would break out again. The one thing that he knew, whatever you thought of Augustus, and he had stopped Romans fighting Romans, which they have been doing for about 100 years. That's how his father had been enslaved. And so his gratitude for that and his determination is that Augustus should stay alive, and that if Augustus wanted a dynasty and wanted his family to continue, then Horace was happy to play his part in that too. And this has sometimes made him sound a bit of a toady, a bit like an apologist. Some people have even said he sometimes sounds a bit fascistic. But I think that is to misunderstand, the nature of that time. Horace was he thought this was he wouldn't have understood our idea of propaganda. Propaganda was a good message that should be propagated, and the message of peace between Romans. Of course, he was quite keen on bashing up foreigners, but peace between Romans was very important. So, and that was dominated to a great extent the last part of his life.
So we don't know that he was in any way in touch, or is sort of a friend, or I don't know, talking to Augustus in any way.
Oh yes, we do. Yes, we do. There are the little mini biography that Suetonius left describes Augustus talking to him as a fat little fucker. Really, he was a fat boy. He was obviously very interested in sex from the point of view, both from his own. His poems reveal that, and whatever you take some of it with a pinch of salt, 1,000 boys and girls and everything, but and whether or not he had a sort of mirror in his house which could show his best body parts to their best advantage, as indeed other Romans did. However certain you are of any of this, that he was a good sort of fun chap to have around. And Augustus at one point not only would make jokes about his weight, and a slightly more barbed jokes about the fact that he didn't seem to have many poems written to Augustus. They all seemed to be written to other people. You can see why Horace would have done that, a bit nervous, writing poems to Augustus. So Horace was a great aimer offer. He didn't try to confront things too directly. And Augustus even asked him to whether he'd come work for him for a while. So yes, they definitely knew each other, and he was very close to Augustus's sort of like main man in Rome, Maecenas, who was his sort of sponsor and patron. So yes, Augustus would have known him. How much Augustus himself was directly involved in or concerned about the poetry is a bit hard to say, but he could see the bits of it that were good for him. Both Virgil and Horace benefited from that. And also, Horace wrote a big poem called the Carmen Circulare, the sort of song of the age, for a massive festival that Augustus set up in order to sort of cement and ceremonialize all his great achievements. And although this again is by no means one of his poetic masterpieces, it certainly proved that he was doing a good job for Augustus that night.
So how was I mean, from what you've been describing, particularly the early poems, this sounds like the Victorians wouldn't have been hugely keen on Horace, but that's, I mean, he would have been a set requirement for those studying classics.
Oh yes, well, if you depend what you're selecting, you see, I mean, Gladstone, our rather prim and proper prime minister, translated all the odes. He claimed to have done it on train journeys when he was moving, between political meetings. And what appealed to Gladstone, as to a lot of Victorians, was particularly what was called the Roman odes, which were Horace's attempts to have a kind of voice of Augustus and to support Augustus's moral reforms, and that's where comes, the line that Wilfred Owen got angry about, the dulcet decores pro patria mori, sweet and noble it is to die for one's country, and which he called, the great lie. Well, there was plenty of that, and for Victorian schoolmasters, not just in Britain but in Germany too. He became a you could put the German children, you sort of sing them at hymn practice, because they instilled they could be edited and selected to instill patriotic values that.
Which I suppose Horace would have been quite happy about then.
Oh yes,
taking your point about propaganda earlier.
Well, I suppose he thought they were well used when he used them. I mean, I suppose it's taking a bit hypothetical, a bit too far to wonder, what he'd have thought if he thought that the Kaiser was, whether he would have been keen on the Kaiser. Maybe he would have been. Maybe been very keen on Queen Victoria. I mean, that's taking the hypothesis a little bit far. But but he was certainly believed in the stability and the necessary stability of the Augustan regime, and that the citizens had to appreciate that and get behind it, and do what they were told. And if Augustus wanted all women to get remarried as soon as they were widowed, and to produce as many children as possible, and he wanted to have tough adultery laws to make sure that people always were in the right bed rather than the wrong bed. Whatever Horace might have thought about that personally, it's probably a lot of nonsense. He would signed up for the official line and promoted it with real vigour.
And so, how was he? I mean, he came from sort of fairly humble beginnings, but if he's mixing with all these elites, presumably he has plenty of money. Where does that come from?
Well, Maecenas gave him a farm. The way it worked, and to be honest, it worked like that for poets, still does to a degree, and worked right up to the poets. There was no money in writing poetry. Very rare at any time, anywhere, has there been, vast sales for poetry. Everyone's on it. So most poets in the 18th century, say, and early in the Romantic period, had patrons, and they had patrons who either supported them directly or who promised to buy their work. Paid inflated prices for their first editions, like Wordsworth had. Anyway, Maecenas gave Horace a farm, which he sort of slightly, my lovely little farm. I suspect it was a pretty big farm, in fact, extremely and very beautiful place. and that gave Horace the freedom, a bit of distance from Rome. It was quite near Rome, but not too near Rome, and it was no doubt productive. And he had his own slaves and own sort of farm managers, and so he got his money from that. And of course, he probably got other money from Romans. We know very little, extraordinary little, about how Romans used and spent and got their money. You referred at the beginning to the other book I did on Crassus, the richest Roman of that time. Although he was extremely rich, and we know that, and we know something about how he got the money, how he actually spent, how he spent it, what you actually did when you bought a house, who did you pay in gold pieces, or did you just sign a letter of credit, or what some sort of mixture? We have very little evidence of that whatsoever. So we don't know any more about Horace and money than we do about almost everybody else. But we do know he got the farm, and I'm sure that kept him going.
He was quite young when he died. I mean, I know age is a bit of a funny sort of marker in that period.
He was in his 50s, and exactly. He was. I don't think he was sort of out of line in his in his age. If you lived to 57, you were doing reasonably well, and so and he certainly had a pretty good life, I think. And but the key problem for this book and for people talking about him is how much of his life can you derive from all the references to his life that there are in the book. I mean, there are people, particularly those that influenced by sort of French theorists, and also would be the current academic orthodoxy would be to say very little. That if he talks about some event in a poem, it's only because he's read about that event in another poem, and he's adapting the poem, and he's not talking about a real event in his own life, whether that's a woman or a boy or a tree falling on his head or a shipwreck or seasickness or wonderful wine. Some people would say, look, we only have the text, and let's not pretend that we know what was going on behind the text. Whereas I take I hope a different and more balanced view. There were other people at the other end who just believed everything that Horace said and said it was all true. And people used to, Victorian clergymen used to traipse over Italy looking for the exact site of Horace's villa, and looking for, treating everything completely literary. Where is the Fons Bandusii that was Splendidio Vitro, favourite poem? Where was that? But in between, I think you can have a judicious sense of where you feel that Horace is telling you something about his life, and where he isn't. And I think what's new about this biography is that it's the first modern biography of Horace that looks at, that tries to extract the life and the work in what I hope is a balanced and sensible way that does allow us to tell Horace's life story, because we know more about him than we do about almost anybody else, even if you think we don't know enough to write a biography, and some people would say that. And they made that point about the Yale, this Ancient Lives series. They say, ancient biography is not a good idea because we just don't know enough.
So we shouldn't bother.
So we shouldn't bother. I mean, that would be people would I've heard people say that. But if you think it is important, particularly if you want to keep people's interest in the subject, in the subject alive, and if you want to write a history or a biography, you have to try and do the best you can to bring the past to life. I think you and I would agree with that. It doesn't mean you exaggerate or are naive about it, but you do your best. And that's what I've done here, and that's what makes this book. And when people say it's a good read and tell some things they didn't know before, and that's what they're talking about, and that's what I'm proud of in the book.
Precisely, and particularly as you mentioned, this is the first. Well, this is the only modern biography.
Yeah, because not that people wouldn't like to have done it. But the people who know most about Horace tend to be the people who dry him up, so much that you can't, that you wouldn't have anything left to write about. I mean, they're very clever people, very sensitive critics often, but they're opposed on the whole to the biographical approach. I can respect where they're coming from, and certainly on some poets or some people in the ancient world, where people say, "I'm going to write a biography," it is pretty ridiculous when we really know. I mean, even a biography of Virgil, we know spectacularly little about Virgil. You couldn't begin to write a biography of Lucretius, we can write biographies of Julius Caesar because he wrote so much of it himself, and other people wrote about him. So there are some people who are genuine biographical subjects, and there's some people who are literally impossible. How people even begin to do it, amazes me. But Horace is a good middle example of someone. If you take a sensitive approach, there is plenty of biographical material there, and there was nobody who really wrote about himself in that way again until Saint Augustine, and after that there was no one till Petrarch. So you've got 1400 years with perhaps only two people giving us that sense of their own lives. I mean, that's an awful lot of time without anybody you can write a biography about.
Absolutely. And I mean, this series has picked out figures that, whilst are well known, I guess they're not as familiar as most biographies that emerge. I mean, you mentioned Crassus. We talked about that. James Ron's spoken about, and
Demetrius Poliorces.
Demetrius, yes,
yes. I mean, he does the Greek. The Greek is a different. There's an extra different thing. I think there's an extra layer of barrier, I think, between us and Greek figures than there is between. We're closer to Roman figures. I mean, we often physically and in time, but there's also a cultural connection between. I mean, that can be can mislead, but there's a cultural connection between us and Horace, in my view, that there isn't between us and Sophocles.
Yes, absolutely. It seems as though, the Roman, particularly Roman poets, you can recognise yourself in some of what they say.
Well, Horace in particular, mostly when you recognise yourself, you are talking about Horace. Though Ovid, he wrote in the Amores and the Ars Amatoria. These are sort of Ars Amatoria are basically how to pick up women in the theatre, and so again, not much taught. You'll be careful teaching that in universities these days, because you can be cancelled or you're thrown out. So you see some of this stuff, and indeed a lot of Horace, I think, it's pretty. People are probably quite careful how they teach it. But
have you heard that, really?
Oh yeah, people are very careful, very cautious. Well, there's some who go on regardless, and some people who think it shouldn't be done at all, particularly in California. There's a whole movement, a whole sort of theory of. I'm not going to knock it. I mean, every reason for reading this stuff, is a good one. But some of them do get, can be extremely censorious, and also and have that terrible failing, self-righteousness about judging the past by our own standards. So here's Horace. Horace owned slaves. He lived in a slave society. He worked for someone who, a kind of MAGA type Trumpian leader who certainly wanted to make Rome great again, and was prepared to sort of lie and cheat and deceive in order to do so. So thoroughly bad age, bad guy. Slept with thousands of women, some of whom had no choice to do what they were told. Let's if we're going to study him at all, let's make sure that people realise, how he wouldn't have been very welcome if you come into our classroom. Well, there's maybe some small room for that, But the trouble is that particular approach can often squeeze out any attempts to look at these characters in the way that they would have seen themselves, or that their time would have seen them, or that other times would have seen them, which is often very different. So even if you believe that he should be cancelled because he wrote about how to pick up girls at the theatre, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at the way other people have looked at the same poem and appreciated it in different ways over time. And then you should also, but most of all, look at how Horace himself or how Ovid himself would have seen these. These are all legitimate, but it's only dangerous if one school, one particular view crushes everything else.
I couldn't agree more, Peter. But this has been absolutely fantastic. And for listeners, the links are in the show notes. Horace, Poet on a Volcano. Once again, they've done a great job on the cover. Looks great.
Yeah, no, isn't it?
It's fantastic. So it just leaves me to thank you very much. Book's out now. And also, we've got your piece coming out in the magazine that is out imminently. And I think by the time this is out, which will be next Saturday, the piece will be out. The magazine will be out. So all links to all these lovely things are in the show notes.
Okay. Thank you. Lovely to talk to you again, Ollie. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye.